You're listening to AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, JP Derapagosian. We are your answer to the question, what is a queer thing I can read, watch, or go to in Minnesota and beyond? And I'm very excited to have a Minnesota-based singer-songwriter bard with us today. Carlisle Evans Peck has an upcoming tour that is going to be touring greater Minnesota here in the next couple of weeks. So Carlisle, welcome to The Gailey Show.
Thank you, JP. It's really wonderful to be here.
Thank you. So why don't we start? Tell us a little bit about your background and what it means to be a bard, because that is not something that we have these days.
It's not something that we have these days. Oh, I'd love to talk about that. So I am a songwriter, composer, performer based in the Twin Cities. And I've lived up here it'll be 9 years this fall. And I've performed as a songwriter and released recorded music for, a little over a decade now. And in this process of making music, I've always had this sense, and it's just like strengthened as my work has deepened and continued, that the songs that I want to write are not just songs. They're not sort of just like one-off tunes, but that there's really like some sort of like story that I want to encapsulate in the song. That there's some sort of like mythological weight that I want to get to in the practice of writing songs and performing music. That I think is really closely tied to this idea of, or this cultural role of a bard, which you're right, we don't talk about that as a role anymore. Right. But this is, what a bard like historically means culturally is, specific to Northern and Western Europe. This like in ancient and even like prehistoric, societies in that part of the world, this cultural role was like one of someone who like kept storytelling alive, kept the myths, the legends that were culturally significant alive. Often, usually in the form of song or in the form of just like oral storytelling. And this is that's like a term that feels aligned with my own background and my own cultural history. But that analogous roles exist in like countless cultural traditions around the world. The importance being like someone who is holding the songs and carrying the songs and the stories and like sort of keeping them alive in both in performance and in ritual and, and in people's minds and hearts. And I feel I've increasingly felt aligned with what that term means. And even though it's maybe a term that feels archaic and outdated and maybe kind of kitschy, depending on your perspective, I think that it's a role that hasn't actually died out. It's just maybe not a word that's used quite so often anymore. Or people don't think of it think of that role as intentionally as maybe it once was. But certainly, I think that culture makers, performers, songwriters, authors, poets, those roles still exist. And there's just maybe less of a like formal, centralized, and like culturally like supported degree to this role in the modern age. So, but I just like naming it, and it feels really, it gives me a sense of sort of like connection with history and ancestry, and also future and descendants, that aligns with specifically this project, that I'll talk about more in a second, Iconoclasm. Um, yeah, yeah.
It makes me think of, as you're describing that I mean, would we say that like Dylan and Joni Mitchell were bards? It feels like that,
That
maybe.
yeah, yeah. I think that that's something that even Bob Dylan, like maybe, or people explicitly said about him in particular. But yeah, I mean, I certainly think that those folks would fulfill that same like sort of cultural role, and yeah, and I mean, there's like countless people working today that also I think would fulfill that cultural role, from like Adrian Lenker to Kendrick Lamar. You know, I mean, there's like, you know, these creators are still holding the cultural mythologies and narratives.
I
Yeah,
think it's fascinating. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And so tell us about Iconoclasm, your new tour.
yeah, yeah. So this project called Iconoclasm. Let me just start with that word. Maybe the word
Yeah.
iconoclasm means it's well it typically had like historically it originated in describing like actually like an early Christian religious movement, which was to so you know there were like icons of saints, like you know these like paintings or like images of holy figures, saintly figures, whatever. And like iconoclasts literally would destroy the icon, so like it means to break an icon. But sort of
Oh,
has it
huh.
has become this an iconoclast is someone who breaks who sort of like um, breaks commonly held notions about individuals or uh, uh, cultural phenomena like societal norms
Yeah.
or whatever, what have you. And this, so the reason that it applies to this project, so a little bit more about the project, the iconoclasm is, as I've been describing it, a ritual cabaret um,
Yeah.
about queer ancestry and uh, reimagining queer ancestry, creating mythology around queer ancestry, and telling forgotten stories. Um, so the premise of it is the premise of the show is it is in one sense this long form like ritual to call up ancestors and ancestral stories, but within the performance, I take on the role of six different um, figures that are inspired by both chosen and uh, blood ancestors of mine, um, that whose stories feel really significant to my own queer identity, and I tell them in the form of like a cabaret. So like, okay, we're gonna call up Bess, and now here's Bess coming to the mic, and she's gonna sing her story in this that nightclub like in between life and death or whatever. And um, and yeah, so the idea being like, there's not a lot, or that we can just always use more queer histories and queer mythologies, and those we have so many cultural mythologies and narratives in the world that we live in, and let's have more queer ones.
What was the process like? How did you come to have that connection with these six individuals that you wanted to, I don't know if channel is the right word, to have be part of this ritual?
Yeah, I do think the channel is an apt word, and the reason that I think it's apt is that this entire project came out of uh, this sort of cognitive dissonance that I felt. My family is like very big on telling oral histories. Like I just like grew up like awash in my older relatives, just like telling not only stories from their life, but like they're telling like ancestor stories. Like they're like, oh, and you know, like great aunt whoever, like you know, great aunt Lottie was like such a hoot, and like her great uncle Zelbert, what a weirdo. Like they like had all these stories and like very specific like anecdotes, and it also these figures felt super vivid and but you know as is like so as is so often the case for so many people, like there there's no overtly like queer folks, because the stories, they get written over. People didn't have the same language. Society
Hmm.
was like incredibly repressive where they were living, so they weren't even out. Or there's euphemisms. So many reasons that history gets written over and forgotten. Um, but yeah, I became just really fascinated with that cognitive dissonance. Like these stories make me feel part of a history, but I don't see myself in any of them, and or at least don't see myself fully. There's like a major part of my who I am that is not reflected in these stories, um, and that just like can't actually be the case. Um, uh, so I did some digging, I did some talking in more recently in the past few years with um, relatives to sort of just like hear stories. My um, my mom has this tradition of every year on Memorial Day going around to the graves of all of her ancestors that are like local, and like spending the whole day.
Wow.
And so I like went around with her again for the first time since I was a kid, and like this time like really like listened with an ear to like all the stories that she would tell about these people. And I sort of let the stories that hit me in a certain way stick with me. And I would say through a process of like um through a process of just like holding these stories that like sort of hit me in a certain way. Maybe I knew them previously. Maybe I knew about this ancestor previously, or maybe this was someone's story that was new to me. I uh, I sort of um, I let the interaction of that person's history like interact with my own identity and my own way of seeing the world. And uh, sometimes a song would come out of it, and sometimes like it would like this it would become clear to me that like this person is a character. This person is some sort of ancestral character that has some significance to my own queer identity, or it says something about me, um, and became a song, became a character, like sort of independent and like independent from the actual historical figure, um, and um, had a place made its place in this performance. And so it's not like I said, some of these ancestors are um, most of them are actual like blood ancestors, but there's also one person story who is a chosen ancestor, and that just felt really significant. Just I mean, thinking about chosen ancestry and like um, who is an ancestor to you is like that can be queered in and of itself. That it doesn't have to be um, like you have so many ancestors that are not the documented ancestors, or the ones that you maybe shared like direct genetic lines to you, and that's significant.
Carlisle, that is so interesting. The idea of we have this very present idea of chosen family, right? And how queer folks have to, find and create that chosen family. But that's always present tense. So you're kind of like blowing my mind right now of the idea of why couldn't that be historical and have ancestors who are part of a community that is chosen ancestors. That I love that. I love that. Like that is really fascinating to me, because a few years ago I talked to a historian Well, I mean, she started life as a historian and then moved into becoming a novelist. And she said that she always received the type of pushback from quote unquote traditional historians because queer history, so much of it has to be intuited and imagined because of all the erasure, right, that happened. And so there is a level of imagination and intuition that needs to go into creating authentic queer history. That doesn't make it less true, right?
Yes.
You have to do that to have that. And so what you're doing here, I imagine, also has that level of intuition. And I might add, and I don't want to project like spiritual connection there, to find that history, because I think for so many of us, when we have to either give up or walk away from family, it can feel very dislocating. Like, who am I now? Where do I come from? So this idea of chosen ancestors, you're blowing my mind. You're blowing my mind right now, Carlisle, in a great way. I love it.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, it blew my mind too, like going down this road, and I that's exactly what I'm feeling. What you just described. Yeah, absolutely. Intuition's a huge part of this.
So I have like a bazillion more questions, but I mean, the most pertinent question is where are your tour dates? Where are folks going to come see you?
Yeah. So we did a couple performances in Minneapolis, but really a big part of this tour is bringing the show to rural locations that I think will really benefit from hearing these queer histories. Building queer rural community, I think, is really important. And so
Yes.
we're touring
Yes.
to Squash Blossom Farm, which is in Orinoco, just north of Rochester. That's this coming weekend. And then the 15th, 16th, and 17th, we're in Western Minnesota, Granite Falls, New London, and Madison, Minnesota, that following week.
Perfect. And a website?
Yeah, CarlisleEvansPeck.com.
Wonderful. Well, I have absolutely loved this conversation. And I know if you go to Carlisle's website, you can see videos as well as find those tour dates and links to how to buy tickets and all of that jazz. But Carlisle, thank you for being on The Gailey Show.
Thank you so much, JP. This was an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. So our podcast and shows are executive produced by Jim Pounds, creative and accounting support provided by Gordy Erickson, production support by Brett Johnson, marketing support by Chad Larson and Jennifer Ogren from AM 950. Follow us on Instagram at the _Gailey Show. Up next, Twin Cities Pride Amplified.